tell you the country is quiet. What they do not tell you is that when the silence gets too heavy, it usually means something is hunting. I learned this the hard way when I inherited my grandfather's ranch in the remote highlands of Oregon. I was a city kid, used to the constant hum of traffic and streetlights that never let the darkness fully settle. Out there, darkness was an absolute. It was thick, heavy, and suffocating. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles down a washed-out dirt road, and cell service was just a myth. When I first stepped inside the old wooden house, the smell of damp pine and years of dust hit me like a physical weight. Every step I took made the old floorboards groan beneath my feet, a long, agonizing creak that echoed through the empty rooms. It felt less like a home and more like a tomb waiting for its occupant. I spent the first few days trying to make sense of the property. My grandfather had lived alone for 20 years, and his mind had supposedly slipped toward the end. That was the explanation the doctors gave for his sudden heart attack. But when I found his journal in the bedside drawer, I started to wonder if something else had stopped his heart. The journal was bound in cracked leather, its pages filled with frantic, jagged handwriting. Most of it was mundane, tracking feed prices and weather patterns. But as I flipped toward the last few entries, the ink changed to a harsh, dark red. The writing became erratic, almost desperate. One entry in particular took up an entire page, underlined so violently that the pen had torn through the paper. It read, "Lock the doors at 10 o'clock at night, and if the cattle start screaming, do not go outside to help them." I stared at those words for a long time. The house was completely silent around me, the kind of breathless silence that makes your ears ring. A cold chill ran down my spine, but I quickly brushed it off. I told myself he was just a paranoid old man losing his grip on reality. I closed the book, tossed it onto the nightstand, and laughed it off. That was my first mistake, and it was the mistake that almost cost me my life. The weather in Oregon can turn on a dime, and that evening, the sky bruised into a deep, sickly purple before unleashing a massive storm. The rain did not just fall. It violently lashed against the window panes like handfuls of gravel thrown by angry hands. The wind howled through the cracks in the walls, bringing a damp, bitter cold into the living room. I sat on the faded sofa, bathed in the weak, flickering glow of a single floor lamp. The power lines in the area were notoriously unreliable, and the light kept dimming, threatening to plunge me into total darkness. The isolation began to press down on my chest.
What was
I
that
felt
noise?
completely cut off from the rest of the world,
Oh my God,
trapped in a
run,
wooden
hide!
box in the middle of a screaming ocean of rain. I tried to focus on a book, but my eyes kept darting toward the narrow gaps in the curtains. I could not shake the feeling of being watched. It is a primal instinct, the feeling you get when eyes are boring into the back of your head from the shadowy corners of the room. I checked my watch. It was 11:30 at night. I had broken the rule. The doors were locked, but my grandfather's warning echoed in my mind. Suddenly, the wind seemed to drop, just for a fraction of a second, and in that tiny pocket of silence, I heard it. It started low, a guttural vibration that rumbled through the muddy earth and traveled straight up through the floorboards into my boots. Then, it escalated into a sound I will never, ever be able to erase from my memory. It was coming from the distant cattle barn, but it did not sound like an animal. It sounded like a choir of human voices, dozens of them, shrieking in absolute, agonizing pain. It was a high-pitched, wet, tearing noise that made my blood run cold. My heart pounded so hard I thought my ribs would crack. I stopped breathing. My muscles locked up, paralyzed by a wave of pure, unadulterated terror. The screaming continued, cutting through the sound of the rain, echoing across the desolate fields. Logic told me to stay put. Logic screamed at me to hide under the bed and wait for dawn. But adrenaline and a misplaced sense of responsibility took over. Those were my animals now. If a pack of coyotes or a bear had broken into the barn, I stood to lose thousands of dollars. Trembling uncontrollably, I forced myself to stand up. I walked over to the gun cabinet, my hands shaking so violently I could barely grasp the cold metal barrel of the 12-gauge shotgun. I grabbed a heavy metal flashlight from the kitchen counter. Its batteries were old, the beam casting a weak, sickly yellow light. I walked to the heavy oak front door. My fingers hesitated over the deadbolt. Do not go outside to help them. The red ink flashed behind my eyes. I swallowed hard, turning the lock with a loud, deliberate click that sounded like a gunshot in the silent house. I pulled the door open, and the freezing wind immediately assaulted my face. I stepped out onto the muddy porch, plunging into the thick, impenetrable darkness. The rain soaked through my clothes instantly. I clicked on the flashlight. The narrow beam of light sliced through the sheets of rain, revealing nothing but the desolate, muddy path leading toward the barn. Every step I took felt wrong. My heavy boots sank deep into the wet earth with a sickening, wet squelch. The beam of my flashlight bounced wildly with every step, creating dancing, elongated shadows that looked like grasping figures in the periphery of my vision. The screaming from the barn had suddenly stopped. The abrupt silence was somehow worse than the noise. It meant whatever was happening inside was finished, and whatever had done it was now waiting. I gripped the shotgun tighter, my knuckles turning white. The wind whipped my wet hair across my face, stinging my eyes. I was entirely exposed, a lone moving target in a vast black void. I kept my eyes locked on the barn doors ahead, slowly closing the distance. The narrow field of vision from my flashlight was my only lifeline, but it also meant I was completely blind to what might be approaching from the sides. The darkness felt alive, pressing in on me from all directions, suffocating my senses. I reached the edge of the fence line, just a few yards from the barn. The smell hit me before I saw anything. It was a thick, metallic stench, heavy with the odor of copper and wet soil. It coated the back of my throat, making me want to gag. I raised the flashlight, sweeping the weak yellow beam across the muddy ground. The beam settled on a massive, dark mound in the middle of the pen. It was the prize bull, lying completely still on its side. I took a hesitant step closer, my breath catching in my dry throat. The flashlight beam revealed a scene that defied all logic and reason. The massive animal had been cut open with a surgical, terrifying precision. Huge sections of flesh were simply gone, removed with cuts so clean they looked like they were made by a laser. But that was not the most disturbing part. There was no blood. Not a single drop stained the wet soil. The muddy ground all around the carcass was perfectly smooth and undisturbed. No human footprints, no animal tracks, no signs of a struggle, just the empty, hollowed-out shell of a 2,000-pound beast left in the freezing rain. The deafening silence of the surrounding fields suddenly felt much heavier. The air itself felt thick and charged with a static electricity that made the hairs on my arms stand straight up. I thought seeing the mutilated animal would be the absolute worst part of this night. But then, my trembling hand slipped. The weak, yellow beam of my flashlight accidentally swept past the barn and illuminated the edge of the dark tree line. My blood ran icy cold. My stomach twisted into tight, agonizing knots that made me want to vomit. Standing just beyond the rusted barbed wire fence, partially hidden by the drooping branches of an old pine tree, was a figure. It was incredibly tall, unnaturally thin, and draped in a heavy, dark, rain-soaked hood that completely obscured its features. The pale beam of my light hit its face, but there was nothing there to reflect it. Just empty, black voids where its eyes should have been. Yet, even without eyes, I knew it was staring right at me. I could feel its gaze. It was a crushing, suffocating stare burning right through my skin, pinning me to the spot like a helpless insect. And then, cutting through the sound of the falling rain, I heard a sound right next to my ear. It was a slow, heavy, wet, wheezing breath. It sounded like air being pushed through a collapsed lung. It was not coming from me. The tall figure at the tree line twitched, its head tilted to the side at a sickening, unnatural angle. Then, it took a step forward. The movement was completely wrong. It was a lanky, jerky, almost insect-like stride. Its heavy boots sank into the mud with a wet, squelching thud. Slap, slap. I did not think. I did not raise the shotgun. The primal, undeniable instinct to survive took over every cell in my body. I turned and sprinted blindly toward the house. The heavy rain lashed against my face, blinding me as my boots slipped and slid in the thick mud. And I could hear it coming, and the muddy footsteps were right behind me. Slap, slap, slap. The sound was closing the distance with terrifying, impossible speed. But I could not look back. Every instinct in my brain screamed that if I turned my head, if I made eye contact with that thing again, I was dead. I reached the bottom of the wooden porch, scrambling up the wet steps on my hands and knees like a terrified animal. But my frozen, trembling fingers fumbled. The heavy brass keys slipped from my slick grip, tumbling over the edge of the porch and plunging into a puddle of dark mud below the steps. I gasped, a pathetic, choking sound escaping my throat. So I dropped to my knees, frantically clawing through the freezing, watery muck in total, absolute panic. I dug my fingers into the cold mud, feeling rocks and twigs, desperately searching for the cold metal. The wet, slapping footsteps hit the gravel driveway. It was right there. I could hear that wet, rattling wheeze vibrating in the air just a few feet away from my neck. My fingers brushed against a jagged piece of metal. I snatched the keys, practically throwing my entire body against the heavy oak door. I jammed the key into the bare metal lock, twisting it so hard I thought it would snap in half. I threw my weight inside and slammed the door shut behind me, instantly twisting the heavy deadbolt into place. A fraction of a second later, a massive, deafening thud hit the outside of the wood. The entire door frame shuddered, sending dust falling from the ceiling. A low, guttural vibration rattled the glass of the nearby windows. I did not stay in the living room. I scrambled backward on my hands and feet, crawling across the hardwood floor until I hit the hallway wall. I dragged myself into the master bedroom, pulling myself into the cramped, dark closet. I curled into a tight, trembling ball in the furthest corner, surrounded by my grandfather's old coats. The claustrophobic space offered a false sense of security. I stayed completely paralyzed in that dark, narrow box for 8 agonizing hours. I did not sleep. I hardly breathed. All night long, beneath the sound of the pouring rain, I listened to it. The slow, deliberate, agonizing sound of fingernails gently scratching against the front door, feeling for a weakness, testing the wood. The next morning, the moment the pale sunlight broke through the heavy clouds, I packed a single bag, got in my car, and drove away as fast as the engine would allow. I sold the ranch to a corporate developer a week later. I took the first offer they gave me. I never went back to Oregon, but the nightmare followed me. Every time it rains heavily, I still hear that wheezing breath. I lock every single door. I check every single window, and I stare at the narrow gaps in my blinds, terrified that one night, those empty, hollow eyes are going to be looking back at me from the street. If you ever inherit a piece of isolated land, and someone warns you about the night, you listen to them. Do not open that door. What would you have done if you heard those screams in the dark? Would you have investigated or hid under the bed? Have you ever felt something terrible watching you from the tree line? Share your creepy encounters down in the comments below. And if you want to survive the night, make sure you subscribe to Lost Horror right now, because the story I am telling next week is even more insane than this one. Do not forget to check the locks before you go to sleep tonight. They tell you the country is quiet. What they do not tell you is that when the silence gets too heavy, it usually means something is hunting. I used to love the peace out here. Now, I know that the silence is just a blanket, hiding the thing that feeds on it. and it is still outside.
This can't be
I took
right.
a job as a ranch hand in the remote high desert of
I
Oregon,
knew we shouldn't have come
miles
out
away
here.
from the nearest paved road. It was supposed to be a reset, a way to escape the crushing weight of the city, the noise, the endless crowds. The ranch was massive, a sprawling sea of golden grass and rolling hills, completely boxed in by a dense, impenetrable wall of dark pine trees. For the first few months, it was absolute paradise. The golden solitude of the days was only broken by the sound of the wind sweeping through the tall, dry grass and the rhythmic chirping of crickets at dusk. I lived entirely alone in a small, weathered wooden cabin on the edge of the property. My only company was a pair of fiercely loyal Australian shepherds. I grew to love the intense isolation. The quiet felt incredibly safe. But I was a fool to think that an empty place is a safe place. The daily routine was always exactly the same. Wake up before the sun crests the hills, mend broken fences, check the long water lines, herd the wandering cattle, and return to the cabin just as the sun dipped behind the jagged tree line. The darkness out there is profoundly different from city darkness. It is an absolute, suffocating black void that swallows the weak yellow light from my porch like a drop of water in the vast ocean. But I had the dogs. If anything so much as a stray coyote wandered within a mile of the cabin,
They won't stop
they would
barking.
immediately let me know.
What is it,
They
buddy?
were my early
What do you
warning
see out
system.
there?
Until the night they warned me about something they could not even comprehend. It happened in late August, during the kind of sweltering heat that makes the air shimmer and warp above the dirt roads. A sudden, violent summer storm rolled over the distant mountains just after midnight. The temperature plummeted in an instant, sending a bitter chill through the drafty house. I was lying awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the heavy rain violently lashing against the thin glass of my window. The thunder rolled deep and low, vibrating aggressively through the old squeaking floorboards right beneath my bed. Then, without any warning, the dogs started barking. It was not their usual warning bark. It was a frantic, hysterical, panicked shrieking. I sat up immediately, my heart pounding furiously against my ribs. I could hear them throwing their heavy bodies against the wooden door of the mudroom, desperately trying to get inside the house. I grabbed my heavy metal flashlight and rushed down the narrow, dark hallway. When I finally yanked the door open, they did not just run inside. They scrambled in sheer terror, their claws slipping wildly on the hardwood floor, whimpering pathetically and tucking their tails tightly between their legs. They crawled straight under my bed and absolutely refused to come out, shivering uncontrollably. I stood frozen by the open door, staring out into the pitch-black yard. The freezing rain was coming down in thick, blinding sheets. I shined my flashlight beam out toward the tree line, but the pale light barely pierced the wall of falling water. And then, the storm just stopped. The howling wind died completely. The heavy rain ceased abruptly, as if a switch had been flipped. A sudden, dead silence fell over the entire ranch. It was an oppressive, unnatural quiet. It was so perfectly silent I could hear the blood rushing loudly in my own ears. The hairs on the back of my neck stood straight up. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. Something was out there in the dark, standing completely still just beyond the fragile reach of my light. I slammed the door shut, locking it and sliding the heavy deadbolt firmly into place, but I did not sleep. I sat perfectly still in the dark living room, clutching a hunting rifle, completely paralyzed by a creeping fear I could not rationally explain, just waiting for the sun to finally rise. When morning finally broke, the sky was a pale, sickly gray. The terrible storm had passed, but the air outside felt impossibly heavy and stagnant. The usual comforting morning sounds of chirping birds and buzzing insects were completely absent. The suffocating silence from the night before had lingered, deeply infecting the daylight. I grabbed my boots and stepped off the front porch, the thick mud sucking aggressively at my heels with every heavy step. I needed to check the herd. I fired up the old four-wheeler and drove out toward the distant north pasture.
There's nothing
The
here.
cattle
Why are
were
we still
usually
standing?
scattered lazily
feel it
across
too.
the rolling hills. But today, they were huddled tightly together in the farthest corner of the fence line, trembling and completely silent. As I drove closer, I saw exactly why. Lying directly in the center of the muddy pasture, completely isolated from the rest of the frightened herd, was the ranch's prize bull. It was a massive 2,000-pound animal, and it was dead. I cut the engine immediately and stepped off the bike. The only sound in the world was the sickening crunch of my boots on the wet gravel. As I walked closer, a sour, heavy, metallic smell hit the back of my throat, making me want to gag. It was not just dead, it was undone. And when I looked closer, that is when my blood truly ran cold. The massive animal lay awkwardly on its side, its dark eyes wide and completely vacant. But there were huge, unbelievable sections of flesh missing from its jaw and stomach. I am a seasoned ranch hand. I know exactly what coyote scavengers look like. I know the brutal tearing of a bear attack. This was neither of those things. The cuts were impossibly clean, surgically precise, as if the thick hide had been removed by a laser. The edges of the deep wounds were perfectly cauterized, but that was not the detail that made my stomach twist into agonizing, sickening knots. I stood there, absolutely breathless, frantically scanning the ground around the massive carcass. The violent overnight storm had turned the entire pasture into a swamp of soft, thick mud. My own boots had left deep, heavy indentations with every single terrified step I took. But around the dead bull, in a perfect, undisturbed 20-foot circle, the wet mud was completely smooth. There were no human footprints. There were no tire tracks. There were no messy signs of a struggle. There were not even hoof prints from the heavy bull itself. It was as if the massive animal had been gently placed down from the stormy sky by a giant, invisible hand. I took a slow step back, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. I looked up slowly, scanning the vast, empty fields, and then my terrified eyes locked onto the dark, jagged tree line in the distance. The shadow of the tall pines seemed to stretch out ominously toward me. I was completely alone in the middle of 1,000 empty acres. But in that chilling moment, I knew with absolute, terrifying certainty that I was being watched. I did not sleep that second night. The silence of the ranch had completely changed its shape. It was no longer a peaceful blanket. It was a heavy, suffocating weight pressing down on the roof of the cabin. I spent hours frantically dragging heavy wooden furniture in front of every single door. I closed every blind, terrified of what might be staring back at me from the absolute blackness outside. The paranoia was intensely paralyzing. Every tiny creak of the settling floorboards sounded like a massive, heavy boot stepping into the hallway. The beating of my own heart was so deafening I thought it would shatter my ribs. Even the sound of my own slow, wheezing breath felt far too loud, practically begging whatever was out there to find me. Around 2 in the morning, the metallic smell returned. It was a sharp, bitter odor of ozone and old copper that seeped right under the crack of the front door. The dogs, usually fierce protectors, were whimpering pathetically beneath my bed, completely refusing to even look at the doorway. And then, the heavy footsteps started. They were impossibly slow and deliberate. A wet, squelching thud directly outside the thin walls of the cabin. Slap, pause, slap. Someone, or something, was slowly pacing around the perimeter of the house in the thick mud. I sat frozen on the couch, clutching my rifle with violently trembling hands, completely unable to breathe. The heavy footsteps stopped right on the front porch. The wooden planks groaned agonizingly under an impossible weight. A long, terrifying shadow blocked out the weak sliver of moonlight creeping under the doorframe. And then there was a knock. 3 slow, deliberate, deafening strikes against the heavy wood. Knock, knock, knock. It was not a demand for entry. It was a cruel, mocking game. It was letting me know that a thin piece of wood was the only thing keeping me alive. I did not move a single muscle until the sun came up. By the third night, the sheer psychological terror had entirely broken me. You can only live in a state of absolute, adrenaline-fueled panic for so long before your mind begins to fracture. I needed to know. I had to see what was hunting me. When the sun dipped below the jagged hills, plunging the ranch back into that terrifying, thick darkness, I did not barricade the door. I walked straight out onto the muddy front porch, holding my rifle in one hand and my heavy metal flashlight in the other. The vast fields were completely dead. Not a single cricket was chirping. The silence was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. Everyone thinks the country is empty at night. I wish they were right. Because when I raised my trembling hand, sweeping the pale yellow beam of light slowly across the desolate landscape, I found exactly what was watching me. The weak beam of light finally settled right on the edge of the dark, imposing tree line. The trees stood like giant, shadowy sentinels in the black void. At first, I saw nothing but thick branches and deep, heavy shadows. But as my terrified eyes adjusted to the pale light, I realized the darkness between two massive pine trees was solid. It was a figure. It was standing perfectly motionless just inside the tree line, blending seamlessly into the pitch-black woods. But the most horrifying detail, the thing that completely paralyzed my vocal cords and made my blood run icy cold, was the height. The figure was standing upright, but it was impossibly, terrifyingly tall. Its head was easily 9 or 10 feet off the ground, towering unnaturally over the low-hanging branches. And right near the top of that massive, dark silhouette, the flashlight beam caught something reflective. Two cold, pale, completely soulless eyes stared back at me from the darkness. They did not blink. They did not move. They just burned into me with a crushing, predatory intelligence that felt ancient and profoundly evil. I could physically feel that heavy, paralyzing gaze piercing right through my skin. A wave of pure, unadulterated terror violently washed over me, locking every single joint in my body. I stood there, totally exposed on the porch, trapped like a helpless insect under the crushing stare of a predator. The massive figure did not step forward. It just slowly, deliberately tilted its head to an unnatural, sickening angle, watching me tremble in the dark.
Did you see that back
I do not remember running.
Keep going.
I do not remember packing. The next clear memory I have is the blinding, artificial fluorescent lights of an all-night diner sitting 50 miles away on a busy interstate. My hands were shaking so violently I spilled black coffee all over the Formica table. I abandoned everything I owned at that ranch. I left my clothes, my truck, my entire life behind in the dark. I have lived in heavily crowded, brightly lit cities ever since. I need the constant noise. I need the sirens and the heavy traffic to drown out the haunting memory of that deafening silence. They say the country is incredibly quiet, but if you listen closely, you will realize the silence is just a breath being held, waiting patiently for the eye to finally light on you. I hope your fields are truly empty tonight. What would you do if you saw those pale eyes staring back at you from the distant tree line? Would you ever go outside in the dark again? Let me know your deepest fears in the comments below. And if you want to survive the night, make sure you subscribe to Lost Horror right now. My next story is going to make you permanently terrified of the dark. Make sure every single door is locked before you try to sleep tonight. My grandfather always said that some secrets are meant to be buried, but he left me the shovel and the map. When I inherited the ranch in the remote high desert of Oregon, I thought the primary challenge would be the isolation. I was wrong. The challenge was the rules. He left behind a leather-bound journal filled with mundane farm notes in black ink, but scattered throughout were warnings written in a violent, jarring red. Never open the door if you hear screaming, one entry read. And never, ever ignore the red ink. I laughed at first, dismissing it as the ramblings of a man lost to dementia. But the desert has a way of stripping away your skepticism. The ranch was a sprawling sea of golden grass, boxed in by an impenetrable wall of dark pine trees. For the first few months, the silence was a gift. It was a reset from the crushing noise of the city. But then came the night the heat broke. A sudden summer storm rolled over the mountains, and the temperature plummeted. My dogs, usually brave protectors, began a frantic, hysterical shrieking. They didn't just bark, they wailed. When I let them in, they scrambled under my bed, shivering so hard the floorboards rattled. I stood by the door, staring into a black void so thick it seemed to swallow my flashlight beam. Then, the storm stopped abruptly. No wind, no rain, just a dead, suffocating silence. That is when I heard it. A scream from the north pasture. It was long, agonizing, and sounded like a human throat being torn open. I reached for the door handle, my instinct to help overriding my fear. But as my fingers touched the cold metal, I felt a searing heat behind my eyes. I looked down at the journal on the table. The red ink wasn't just red anymore. It was glowing. It was pulsing like a heartbeat, the words "do not help them" appearing to bleed off the page. I pulled my hand back, my heart hammering against my ribs. I spent the rest of that night clutching a rifle, watching the door as something slow and heavy began to pace the perimeter of the cabin. Slap, pause, slap. The sound of wet feet on wood. The next morning, the silence had infected the daylight. I drove to the pasture and found the prize bull. It was dead, but not just dead, it was undone. Huge sections of flesh were gone, removed with surgical precision. There was no blood, not a single drop. And in the thick mud surrounding the carcass, there were no tracks, no footprints, nothing. Just a 20-foot circle of perfectly smooth, undisturbed earth. I felt a heavy, predatory gaze burning into the back of my neck. I looked toward the tree line, and for a split second, I saw it. A shadow that was too tall, too thin, standing perfectly still. I realized then that the red ink wasn't a warning from a crazy man. It was a survival manual. The paranoia became a physical weight that second night. Every creak of the house felt like a heavy boot stepping onto the porch. I spent hours dragging furniture against the doors. But the red ink in the journal kept changing. New sentences appeared in real time, wet and shimmering. It is looking for a weakness. My breath felt too loud in the suffocating silence. Around 2 a.m., the metallic smell of ozone and old copper filled the room, seeping through the cracks. Then came the knocks. 3 slow, deafening strikes. Knock, knock, knock. It wasn't an invitation. It was a taunt. I sat in the dark, my knuckles white on the rifle, watching the shadow under the door grow longer and thinner. By the third night, my mind began to fracture. The screams started again. But this time, they sounded like my own voice crying for help from the woods. The red ink flashed a warning so bright it turned the room crimson. Do not look at the eyes. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped onto the porch. I swept the beam toward the tree line and froze. Standing 10 feet tall, between 2 pines, was a figure. It was impossibly thin, draped in shadow, with 2 pale, unblinking eyes that felt like they were peeling back my soul. It didn't move toward me. It just tilted its head at a sickening, broken angle and watched me tremble. I don't remember the drive away, only the blinding lights of a diner 50 miles away. I sold the ranch and never looked back. But sometimes, when it rains, I see a faint red glow on my walls.
Don't breathe.
If you ever find a rule written in red, obey it. The silence is never empty. It is just waiting for you to open the door.